The title of our message for today is Our Christian Forefathers. Who founded America? It was a group, a small group. It was one church that first founded America. It was not a group. It was a small church. They was not a part of any denomination. They were called separatists. Separatist means they separated themselves from the Church of England. Now, the Church of England had some freedom of worship, provided that you went to the Church of England. And if you didn't go to the Church of England, you were in trouble. There was a small group of Christians in a little place called Scooby, England. They refused to be a part of the Church of England. They did not believe that they were teaching according to the Scriptures. So they separated themselves, and they were punished for it. When Henry VIII formed the Church of England, he gave some freedom outside of the Church of England, but not much. When his daughter, Bloody Mary, came on the scene, it was horrible. She killed a lot of Christians simply because they would not conform, and she was taking the church back into the Catholic system. When she was removed from the throne, then Queen Elizabeth came. And Queen Elizabeth gave some freedom, but she also took the approach, if we deal with some severely, the rest of them will not get out of line. And then came King James. And King James even intensified the persecution of Christians. And so there was a small church, and they heard that there was religious freedom in Holland. So they fled to Holland so that they could worship God as they saw fit from the Scriptures. They lived there 12 years. They had freedom of worship, but the people in Holland didn't necessarily appreciate them being there. For an example, they had to work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And the children, as soon as they was old enough to work, they had to go to work. So they came to the conclusion, we cannot keep this up. Our bodies cannot endure 12 hours of labor 6 days a week. So they began to make plans to go to America. So in July of 1620, they made their first attempt to sail to America. There was several problems which caused delays, and they had all their belongings on 2 ships. And because of the delays, they used up a lot of their goods that they intend to use on the voyage and when they came to America. Oh, and let me say this. The man who worked out a deal for them to get a loan to make the trip, he cut them a good deal. He only charged them 50% interest, if you've ever heard of such a thing. So in September the 6th, 1620, the Mayflower sailed. Originally, they intended to sail in July. So they set out in September. There was 102 passengers on board. 58 of them were separatists from one church who started in England, moved to Holland. There's 58 of them on board, and there are 44 strangers. Now, who were the strangers? They were strangers to the church. Some of them were Christian, some of them were not, but they were not a member of the church. So they were given the nickname separatists and strangers. And so they head out on September the 6th. And there was a sailing crew of 27. The Mayflower was 90 foot long, and it traveled at a magnificent speed of 2 miles an hour. And it's over 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean. The Mayflower was not a passenger ship, it was a cargo ship. And all the people had to live on the second deck, and the ceilings were 5 foot high. So that's one of the inconveniences they had. It was a cargo ship. There was no bathrooms. There was no bedrooms, but there was plenty of lice and plenty of mice and rats. The captain had never sailed to America before. Now here's some of the things that they carried on the ship. They carried chickens, goats, pigs, 2 dogs, dried beans, dried peas, barley, and dried fruit, butter, cheese, and biscuits, and salt meat. Now, I think you probably remember from studying that in those days, you were encouraged to drink a cup of lemon juice a day on the ship. What was the name of the, they're slipping me, what was the name of the disease they got? Scurvy. So, one of the people on the ship refused to drink the lemon juice, and after the ship landed, he did die. The sailors did not like this group. In fact, one of the sailors said, let me quote, "I hope to throw half of your dead bodies overboard." About 3 days later, after he said that, he came down with extremely high fever. And guess what? He went overboard in a bag. They were required to stay below deck most of the journey because most of the journey was one storm after another. So, what did it create? They were not able to empty the slop jar. There was constant vomiting from seasickness. They were not able to wash clothes. These are the few things. One man, young man, he couldn't stand it any longer. He said, I'm going up top. I'm going to get some fresh air. They had been warned, no one go up top. It was too dangerous. But you know, sometimes you can't tell teenagers what to do. They know, you know what I'm saying. So he went up top, and the boat made a tremendous lean to one side, and he fell overboard in the North Atlantic. And the Navy tells us that a person can live in the North Atlantic during the cold season about 4 minutes. He fell overboard. Some of the rope on the ship also fell overboard. And by the grace of God, he was able to grab one of the ropes. And by the grace of God, in the midst of the storm, one of the sailors saw him, and they pulled him back on board. Not one of the pilgrims died during that 65-day journey. I may say this twice as I go through this, but the Puritans and the Pilgrims greatly emphasize you do not complain about anything. You trust God with your problems. So I've given you a few problems. Let's mention a few more. The main beam in the ship cracked. And if it could not be corrected, the ship would go down. We believe in the sovereignty of God and in the providence of God. And the captain was trying to figure out what could they do to save the ship. And one of the pilgrims says, we have a jack screw amongst our supplies. And they took this giant jack screw and they raised this beam back up to its normal place. And they continued to sail. A fire broke out on the ship down below. And to make things a little worse, they had a lot of gunpowder down there. And by the grace of God, they got the fire put out without it reaching the gunpowder. So they were on the ship for 65 sick, hard days. Now, the governor, who later on when they get there, he becomes the governor, William Bradford, he continually emphasized this to the people. Let me quote, hardship is a correction bestowed by God. So they had emphasized over and over again, you do not complain. You work to solve your problems, but you do not complain. We need some of that today, a lot of that today. So when they came to America, after being on at sea 65 days, they was off the shore of Plymouth, and they wrote the Mayflower Compact, which set the course for American government. Let me read the first sentence in the Mayflower Compact. Having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith, and to honor our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. Their purpose was to come to worship God and to propagate the Christian faith. When they got there, they was at Cape Cod on December the 12th, but they did not, all the people did not go to shore until December the 20th. So each day they would send out some men to explore. They found 40 bushels of corn stored, which they desperately needed. Now let me say this, we may not be aware of it, but people by and large lived on the Mayflower that winter. They got there, they got off the boat on December the 20th. That's not exactly the best time to start living in the wilderness. There was no one there to greet them. Now, I want to tell a little story about how God used an Indian to save them in their desperation. Let me tell a little bit about the Indian named Squanto. Squanto was captured by a captain of a British ship. They were there, this was in 1614, this was 6 years before that. He was captured, taken back to Europe, and he was sold as a slave. They got good money for him. So while he's in Europe, he learns to speak the English language. And then in 1619, a year before the Pilgrims come, he hears about a ship coming to America, and he was able to make a plea to the captain, and the captain felt sorry for him, and he brought him to America. So when he came back, he came to Plymouth. That's where his village was. His tribe consisted of between 1,000 and 2,000 people, but a disease went through their village and killed everyone. Since he was not there, he was the only person left in the village. This was a very warlike tribe. The other Indians considered it as haunted, that evil spirits lived there, so no one would go to Plymouth. Now, they had prepared ground because they farmed it there. And it's amazing that God let the ship come to that place. One day in March, after they had gone through the first winter, and the first winter, their number dropped from 102 to 48. They're in dire straits, and it's March. And one day an Indian walks into their village that they're building, and he said, "Hello." They couldn't believe that he could speak Indian. This was Massasoit, Somerset. Somerset also had learned the English language, but he had not gone to America because he had sold fur to the traders and fish to the traders, so he had learned it. And he saw that they were in dire straits. And a week later, he returned with another Indian. The Indian he brought this time was Squanto. Squanto could speak the English language, and he told the people how to take care of themselves. One of the first things he did, he showed them how to catch eel. And he said, next week, the fish will be coming in from the ocean and be going upstream, and we will harvest many, many, many fish. And he showed them how to catch them. He showed them how to plant corn, showed him how to make maple syrup. So he was a God-given blessing from God. Now, in April, after the first winter, the Mayflower sailed back. They're down to less than 50 people. And the captain made a little speech. And he says, we're sailing tomorrow. Anybody that wants to go, they get free passage back. You want to guess how many got on the Mayflower? None. You see, these people, they were a tight-knit group in England. They went to Holland. They was a tight-knit group. Their family was their church. They were committed to one another. They had come to have freedom of religion, and they was not going to give up their freedom even if it meant death. It wasn't long after this until the people at Plymouth made a treaty with the nearby Indians. And these are the 4 points that was in the treaty. They agreed not to steal from one another. They agreed to defend one another. They would not take weapons when they went to visit each other. And they would try to get other Indian tribes to become a part of that treaty. So when spring came, they planted their harvest. And long about the end of September was the first Thanksgiving. There was no tablecloths. There was no tables. But they had the beautiful fall colors. And they had invited the Indians because they had a wonderful crop. 90 Indians showed up. 48 Englishmen, 90 Indians. But they were in a peace treaty with one another. Now the Indians didn't come just to eat their food. The Indians brought 5 deer and 12 turkeys. They took their dried fruit. There was cherry pie, there was apple pie, there was blueberry pie. And there was a lot of stew, and there was seafood. In fact, they had such a wonderful time at the first Thanksgiving, it lasted 3 days. And the Indians went back during that 3 days, they went back and killed some more animals and brought them back in. So it was a wonderful, wonderful time. They were not thanking the Indians, as our textbooks like to say today. They were thanking God. And in 1789, George Washington declared a national holiday. Thanksgiving would be a national holiday. Now, I want to switch over, and I want to talk a little bit about the Pilgrims and the part that they played. We all know the story about the Pilgrims and their Thanksgiving, but do you know the story of the Puritans and their Thanksgiving? It's just as big a story. Now, who are the Puritans? The Separatists completely broke away from the Church of England. The Puritans wanted to stay in the Church of England but purified. Luther took the same path. Luther wanted to stay in the Catholic Church and reform it. He saw that he couldn't do it. In the year 1628, now the Pilgrims came in 1620. The Church of England came up with a list. Every minister in England got an O or a P behind his name. Those were O, they were Orthodox. They were loyal to the Church of England. Those who got a P by their name, they were Puritans. And so they began to see that they also was going to have to flee England. So in 1628, a group of Puritans came, and they was going to break the ground, build some buildings, and get things ready. And in 1630, a large number of Puritans were coming over. Now, a little difference between Pilgrims and Puritans. Puritans were well educated, many of them very wealthy. They had a lot of influence. The Puritans had none of this. What the Pilgrims had, and the Puritans envied it. This little church had a strong, bonded family. They was committed to one another. The Puritans came from all over England. They was not a bonded group at that time. And they saw the importance of loving God, but being bonded to their brothers and sisters in Christ. So John Winthrop had been elected to be the leader of the Puritans. So after 2 years, he came with 2 ships, 200 people, and he came to the community of Salem, where the first Puritans had landed, and he was devastated. The group was extremely discouraged. Many of them just quit working. They saw no use. And so when John Winthrop came, almost nothing had been built. Let me quote John Winthrop, the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And he said, "This is my desire as governor." Listen to this. "I desire to make it one of my chief petitions to have the grace to be poor in spirit. I will ever walk humbly before my God, and meekly and mildly and gentle towards all men. I do resolve first to give myself, my life, my wits, my wealth, and my health to the service of my God." These are the people who broke the ground. These are our forefathers. This is the kind of life that they taught. The Pilgrims had compassion in church family and persecution. The Puritans had not had nearly as much of that, but it would come. When the Pilgrims came, they did not want the government running the church. William Brewster was the head of the church at Plymouth. William Bradford was the head of the government. They worked close together, but one did not control the other one. And that's where we got separation of church and state. Working together, but not one controlling of the other or fighting against each other, as it had been presented in our day to follow. As the 200 people got ready to sail from England, they had a sermon as they got on the ship. And this is one of the statements that the pastor said. He stayed back behind. And it says, "You go to propagate the gospel in America." These are our forefathers. They came for religious freedom. Now, why is it that the colony at Jamestown did not succeed in Virginia? They came to make money. And God did not want this country based on an economic system. The Pilgrims and the Puritans came for religious freedom and to propagate the gospel. Jamestown did not succeed, but the Pilgrims and the Puritans did. Let me show you how God blessed them. In the first 30 years, from 1620 to 1650, 198 ships came to America bringing people who wanted freedom of religion. 198 ships, only one was lost. Unbelievable. Now, I want to tell you about the Puritans. Well, let me back up a minute and tell about the first Thanksgiving at Plymouth. They had planted their crops. Everything looked beautiful. It looked like it would be an abundant crop. All of a sudden, there was a drought at Plymouth. The Indian witch doctors came and they danced and they did their thing to bring down rain. The Puritans got together and they prayed and they fasted because the corn was dying, the beans were dying, the pumpkins were dying, everything was dying, and there was no more seed to plant another crop. But as you read the diaries of those leaders, no one complained. And it looked impossible. For the next, after they prayed and waited upon God, for the next 14 days, there was a gentle rain, no lightning, no thunder, no wind, just a gentle rain for 14 days. And they had an abundant crop for the first Thanksgiving. All right, now, I want to go back to the Pilgrims' first Thanksgiving. They came in July of 1630. Maybe I'm wrong. I think it came a little earlier than that. Anyway, they got the crops planted. And they also had abundant crop in 1630. And the mayor or the governor of the colony says, we will have abundance to get through the winter. No problem. But along about August, a couple of ships with 100 people apiece came. They brought no provisions whatsoever. So they relied totally upon the Puritans to provide for them. And then after that, here come the third ship of another 100. Well, the governor knew that there's no way they could take on an extra 300 people and get through the winter. So he sent one of the ships back to England to load it with the supplies and come back as soon as possible. Every day, they're watching the sea to see if there's a ship out here. It came down to February the 5th. Governor Bradford wrote in his diary, "Today I scooped out the last scoop of meal and gave it away." Not one word of complaining. Not one word. He believed that God would provide. He's got over 1,000 mouths to feed, and he doesn't have one bite of food to give them. It was in the afternoon, and someone hollered out, "A ship!" And they all went running, and they saw a ship coming into harbor. But it wasn't one ship, it was two ships. What had happened? The Puritan ship, on the way back from England, found a ship broken down at sea. So they towed them and brought them to America. That was the delay. But guess what? The broken down ship was loaded with food and supplies. And the ship that was coming back from England was loaded with supplies. That was on February the 5th. The next day, Governor Bradford said, "We will have a Thanksgiving meal." So in the bitter cold of winter, the Puritans had their first Thanksgiving a few years after the Pilgrims had theirs. The book that I read, quoting from the diaries of the men of that day, he said we could not find one person complaining, even though they were they had used up their last meal. Now, what did the Puritans and the Pilgrims give to us? Let me mention a few. They gave us a strong work ethic. They gave us strong purity before marriage. They gave us modesty in dress. Their shops were closed on Sunday. There were laws against immorality. And they gave us tremendous wisdom. For an example, if our Congress today would have to write a constitution for America, I'm afraid that they couldn't even come close to giving us what the great wisdom men of that day was given. And here was a favorite topic that the pastors preached on, and it was this subject: nothing clouds the mind like premarital sex. So what do we need? We need not only to honor our Christian forefathers, we need to go back and participate in the same things that they were teaching. We'll be a different society as we do. We cannot make other people do it. But we can say, as for me and my house and my church, we're going to be faithful to God. We're going to be Puritans in our way of living. And we're going to propagate the gospel of Jesus Christ. Okay, Levi. All right, our closing hymn